right,
Yeah.
perfect. So let me pull up my notes. All right. So hi everyone. My name is Sarah Hibner. I am a graphic designer and a creative director. By day, that's my day job. But in my free time, I have a lot of different interests in a lot of different realms. And I try to use design and basic web development as a way to just expose those ideas to the light of day. And this project, Where Am I, is a really great kind of summary and culmination of a lot of those efforts, especially within the past year. So I made this project in August to visualize my digital extensions of self, specifically the places where I'm active online. It's not comprehensive, which is kind of scary to think about because this already feels like a lot of social media profiles to have, a lot of places to kind of be stretched out in terms of trying to have an online presence. So it's just even more overwhelming to realize that this isn't even, this is just the tip of the iceberg. But um, my goal with this project was really not just to visualize where I am, but to be almost aspirational about where I'd like to be. Uh, in the future online. I think that a lot of our online presence is kind of passive sometimes, and it just builds on itself over the years. We kind of migrate to different platforms or social media silos. We develop different digital patterns of interaction, and I kind of liked the idea of just having a living map of that. So that's what this page represents. Um, and I think that it's important for people to, I guess, consider where they are online in a more high level way, just because, in society, we talk a lot about personality integration and reaching higher levels of knowledge and just, being this aspirational society. But I think that social media by its nature tends to cause us to compartmentalize and to refract and to fragment a little. So this project is kind of a way to figure out if there's a way to be integrated as a as an online persona, to be integrated when you're in so many places at once. Um, so really quickly, some of the sources of inspiration that informed not just this project, but some of the other projects that I'm going to show today, and even this outer space website that this project lives on. I'm going to talk about three really quick sources of inspiration. So Gwern, oh, let's see if I can reload that. Gwern.net. Gwern is a huge source of inspiration for me. I don't know. Here we go. Um, this is one of the first places I came across years ago that really got me thinking about how it is that we present ourselves online, and not just ourselves, but our ideas and the ongoing projects or concepts that we may be developing. Specifically, Gwern's thoughts on a long site and on long content on the web were huge sparks of inspiration for me at a time when, as you'll see in one of my later projects, it just feels like information on the web is so ephemeral. So finding somebody who has a longer view about what they do on the web and why they're doing it really resonated with me. And I definitely try to apply that kind of temporal context to a lot of the web projects that I work on. Um, aside from that, there was an IndieWeb pop-up event that happened this spring that really made me start thinking about how I represent the way that I represent myself online. So this page is actually a summary of all of the participants and a lot of the notes and just some of the topics that we discussed. And it was just a really important moment for me, not just at a high ideas level, but specifically at a more granular level in terms of actual technology that I could use to start trying to better represent myself online. So this is actually where I discovered or learned about TiddlyWiki, which I had never heard of before, but that's actually one of the wiki tools that I'm using on one of the websites that I'll show today as well. So it was just a really inspirational um, pop-up session for me, and I know a lot of other people got a lot out of it. I know we're trying to do another pop-up session in the IndieWeb that's a follow-up to this, but we just haven't gotten around to it yet. So yeah, that was the second source of inspiration. But then the third source of inspiration was Yewan's Songs website. So I saw her speak at Typographics 2020, which was a typography conference that happened online in the spring as well. And I just really love her approach to web design and to interactivity and having fun and being playful with the projects that she does. So I won't go too far into this site, but I highly recommend you check out her work because she just does some amazing, amazing stuff. Um, so going back to this project though, how did I make it? So as I mentioned, I kind of mentioned it earlier. I have like some web development knowledge, but it's basic. A lot of the websites that I build use basic CSS and HTML. In this case, this is using SVGs and Flexbox, essentially. I thought when I first designed this in Figma, I tried to not constrain myself by worrying about how it was going to be built at first. So I just tried to make it, in an ideal world, what would this look like if I could build it? And then when I realized that it was a little too custom to try to like shoehorn into a certain charting or diagramming library, that's when I just realized like, okay, well, how would I go about building this then? And you can see that there are some differences, but for the most part, I think it communicates the overall essence of what I wanted to. So it's just, maybe some spacing stuff. So that taking a step back, that Where Am I project is one example of like the many different types of projects that I've been trying to get up to in the past year. Um, and it's nice because it is a good mapping of everywhere that I'm at. So sarahhibner.com is kind of my main portfolio site where I try to kind of keep a design log of any personal projects that I've been working on. Practicing Design is my Short Now blog. So it's a blog where I write about design and development in contexts that I maybe don't expect to be as relevant in the next year or two or as relevant. So, plugin reviews, maybe Notion templates, productivity related tools and writing. That's kind of what I try to stick to on the practicing design end. And then on the outer space end, which is the website that we're on right now, this is really where I try to focus more on ongoing long-term projects that are less blog post material and maybe are more one-off projects. So that's actually what I'm going to go to next in this tab. But then just further down here, we also have configuration space, which is for the writing arm of my activities, the fiction writing arm, especially fan fiction. And then down here, this is my little digital garden. So it's a nice little map. And I'm going to jump to outer space. But before I do get into this, do you have any questions yet, Jared, or anything that you wanted me to clarify? All right. Well, I don't think I can hear you, so I don't know if you're speaking, but I will keep
Sorry.
going.
Yep. My bad. I was muted.
Oh,
Yeah, I was wondering about the IndieWeb pop up event that happened and just like what your involvement and experience has been with the IndieWeb technologies and community.
yeah, definitely. So I had not been involved at all in the indie web until the pandemic. So
Okay.
indie web is such at their core, they're very much about the indie web camps, which are
Mm.
usually in-person activities. Which usually I think it's like a usually 2-day activity, um, kind of like a mini conference, although they also do have actual indie web conferences. But indie web for me has really been an amazing community just in terms of um, connecting with people who really value, how do I put it? Like, I think just in this age of like social media, the proliferation of social media platforms and digital platforms in general, even beyond social media, I think it's nice to find people who kind of want to go against the grain and just maybe for whatever reason, because there's so many different reasons that you might have, they kind of just want to own their own data or own their own website. And so IndieWeb just brings together a lot of really interesting people in that regard, because you get people who are developers who know what they're doing, who are developing tools that are being used by the indie web community at large. But you also have people who are novices who, they've never done anything in terms of building a website, and maybe this is their first time buying a domain or buying hosting or installing a WordPress instance or something. So I think IndieWeb is cool in that sense because it really, I mean, it doesn't matter what your level of expertise is, it's very welcoming. And I think that the main goal is really just, however you do it and however much you do it, um, exposing people to the idea that you can control a little bit more as how you present yourself online. So the Gardens and Stream pop-up session was um, the first I would call it major indie web event that I went to, and it was a virtual event, and it was essentially only meant to be an hour long at first, but as you can see here, it ended up lasting almost 3 hours.
Oh wow.
And we had, it's great because it's all documented here. That's just part of the indie web culture, obviously, is for every meeting that we have an Etherpad, which then gets cleaned up and added to the wiki page. So I just I found this was just such I'd never been to an event like this before. I'm kind of like a digital hermit and an in-person hermit too, so I've kind of been slow to share my ideas online and to become part of online communities. And this was just such a revelation, this event, and it continues to inspire me. But just hearing different people's approaches to gardens and streams, how they structure the information that they post online and what context they use to organize it, whether it's temporal like I use or whether it's something completely different. It was just I highly recommend anybody who's curious. IndieWeb has weekly homebrew website clubs where it's a very casual kind of laid back environment, but there are also pop-up events like this and conferences where if you're curious, I highly recommend it because you can definitely come out feeling really inspired.
Yeah, that sounds like just through the glimpse I'm getting of this event, it sounds like, yeah, there was some really awesome stuff being discussed.
Yeah, like
Uh,
even just for instance, this distinction between wikis and commonplace books. And I think for me, I enjoyed that it was evenly split between some of the more abstract topics and some of the more granular topics about like what specific, potentially drawbacks and benefits for different types of wiki software or frameworks. So I definitely thought it was cool in that sense.
so
Cool. So I guess this brings me to outer space, and I'm starting there just because you've already seen one of the projects on there. But some of the other projects that I have on here are intro to variable fonts. So this is technically a presentation that I made for the latest or the most recent IndieWeb conference, which was IndieWeb Camp East 2020. So this was my intro to variable fonts, as well as creating an intro for somebody else. I only learned about variable fonts this summer, and I was super intrigued by them and wanted to kind of have an excuse to explore them more. So instead of creating like a slide deck or a slideshow, I just decided to create a website that kind of showed the value and the possibilities of variable fonts itself. So that's essentially what this is. It's pretty simple. I really would like to go back and improve it, but in a lot of cases, I try to make like the minimum viable product to communicate my idea and then accept that I can iterate upon it later. Um, just because one of my problems tends to be otherwise I'll get like so balled up in the details and in trying to perfect something that I won't publish it at all. So I've tried to get better about just getting that minimum viable product out. Um, so yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on this one, but I do love variable fonts, and I recommend anybody who hasn't explored them to take a look, especially even if you go here. I have included a bunch of examples of cool things that you can do. They're just embedded CodePen examples, but just some of the cool things that I've found that you can do with examples of how they're built, essentially, which I think is super important. So anything that you see in these examples is something that you can very easily go in and um,
Watery sweat.
look at the code. Yeah. So then we've seen Where Am I, but two of the other projects on here that I just quickly want to touch upon. So Visual History of Delicious Bookmarks. I loved Delicious when it was around. It had a huge impact on me in terms of my obsession with media preservation and with the ephemerality of digital information in general. Um, I think it's kind of funny because this is called the Visual History of Delicious Bookmarks, but then it goes into a written history first. But my goal was really just, this started because I had been collecting obsessively screenshots of delicious designs at different points in time on the Internet Archive. And I just ended up with this huge folder of images, and I realized that this is something I wish I could have been able to find when I was doing the research in the first place. So I just decided to
So that started before any inclination of making it a page on your site.
oh
You were
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And this is an example of like, I feel like sometimes I don't always have like this clear stroke of insight for a project, right? It's not like I'm like, ah, yes, I'm going to create a visual history of delicious bookmarks. It's more like over the years, I end up doing these random research projects and going down these random rabbit holes and realizing that I should do something with that research instead of just letting it sit in a folder on my desktop. Um, so yeah, and this is another example where, you know, for one of my next goals with this is to actually make it more of a timeline format and to play around with maybe even playing around with different timeline formats in the same data set, if that makes sense. So like, or even making parallel timelines. I don't really know, but I like the idea of connecting some of the milestones that I mentioned in the written portion of this to some of the visual milestones that are included in this visual timeline down here.
Yeah, I can see that being really, really, really cool.
Yeah. Um, so then the last project I'll touch upon here, which is honestly my favorite, this was the first one that I did once I decided to start just putting my ideas out there, um, was visualizing how much it cost me to commute without owning a car in 2019. So this is something that I built using ZingChart, which I'm at the beginning of this, I said that I am a designer and a creative director. And one of the companies that um, I work for, that I am the creative director for, is actually ZingChart, which is a JavaScript charting library. So this project was also in part my attempt at just learning how to use the library better. Because I don't know JavaScript really, but I can like Frankenstein it together if I need to. So and I guess this page is a case in point with that, just because it is a charting library. Like there's stuff that I don't know, it's cool. Some of the stuff that I was able to include here that helped me, like I said, just understand the limits of the library. And it's an interesting position because I'm also in a position where I'm helping to design parts of the library too. So working on projects like these kind of helps me understand what the constraints are and what, you know, potential areas of improvement are, or yeah. So I'm really excited about this project just because I am a huge proponent of alternative forms of transportation and e-bikes. So I love e-biking myself, and I think that having information like this out there might make it easier for other people who maybe, you know, are on the fence about alternative forms of transportation, or just want to know at a more granular level, like what are, you know, how much does it cost if you are trying to get around. So actually this is an example where I did not use e-bikes, or if I did, they were rented e-bikes. So this whole year in 2019 I essentially um, used rentable scooters and rentable bikes and Ubers and public transportation. And in 2020, I got an e-bike. So um, I want to do a follow-up where I compare how much I spent in 2020 on commuting, even though it's skewed obviously because I didn't go anywhere. But even just comparing the costs of an e-bike 1 year versus the combined costs of all these other forms of transportation the previous year.
Did you have to do a lot of manual data wrangling to get this out, or?
So that's a really good question. And I actually go into more depth about it here in this blog post that I wrote about it. So I initially tried to request my personal data from each company that I used, but from a data cleaning perspective, that just became a nightmare trying to normalize all of that. So, and in some cases, the window of time that the company had for having stored my data was not the same. So in some cases, it was only 3 or 6 months. In other cases, they were able to give me all of my data ever. Um, and I kind of go into this towards the end, but it brought up some interesting points about data privacy where, you know, I was getting frustrated that I couldn't get certain data past a certain point. But then I realized that from a data privacy perspective, that's probably a good thing. So the way that I ended up ultimately getting the data for this was through my bank statements, actually. I decided that that was because this project was focused specifically on the cost of commuting and because my other sources of data were unreliable or maybe not unreliable, but just not um, similar enough, the bank statements ended up being the best way. And yes, that was tedious. There's probably a way that I could have done it more simply, but I literally just went through my bank statements for the year and searched for the company names.
It works, yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that I tried to do with this is um, if anybody wanted to see how it's built, obviously you could view the source for the project and do it that way. But there is also this little IDE, which is taking a long time to load right now. Yeah, there's this little IDE that just shows, it's a little code editor that shows exactly what JavaScript, CSS, and HTML went into creating it, as well as, let's see, yeah, just showing essentially like everything that I did to build it. It's essentially the exact same page, just in this code editor. But yeah, in case anybody wanted to play around with it, you could. But yeah, so that's everything for outer space. Did you have any questions? There's actually one more thing I want to mention, but did you have any questions about it before I move on to other stuff?
Um, Mainly just so for each of these projects on here, are they sort of totally independent HTML JavaScript projects and you just kind of link
Yes,
them out
yeah.
here?
And
Or
that's essentially how, so my approach to my, like none of, with the exception of two, all of my websites are static HTML and CSS. There's some drawbacks to that, obviously, in terms of like ease of being able to search through things or filter things or categorize things. But over the years, I've just found that static HTML and CSS for me is the most sustainable. Um, in some cases, I feel like it takes me as much time to build a project just in a code editor as like trying to make it happen in a CMS. So that's kind of just worked for me. And yeah, that is the approach. So every single one of these is essentially just like, you know, a blank slate. You know, what do I want to do this time?
awesome. Yeah.
And
And
then, oh, go ahead.
similarly, with you mentioned with the Where Am I project, that was kind of like you started in Figma and just kind of did whatever with before thinking about technical limitations. Is that
Yeah,
generally the
yeah.
approach?
The,
Or?
I tr It depends. There's some cases where I don't do that, and I think the best example of that is my TiddlyWiki site. So this is a static representation of like a node-powered TiddlyWiki website that I have that I run locally, and this, you know, I'm sure there are people out there who are a lot better at modifying their TiddlyWikis than I am. This is as much as I was able to do here, but this is a case where I'm not really as worried about the aesthetics of the site, and I kind of just want the information to just be there. So yeah, this would be the exception. This would also be the exception. This is just this is a statically generated site using the Hexo framework, which is a JavaScript framework, but it's also node based. And this is just somebody else's. It's actually Peter Robert's cactus theme. So this is also a case where, you know, I didn't build this out or design this out at all. I kind of just allowed the theme to dictate how it looked and modified it from there. So yeah, I think that in some cases it depends on what the purpose of the project is, because practicing design and Meet Me in Space are very writing focused, and they're not really focused on the visual representation of the thing I'm communicating. I didn't worry as much about those. Yeah. One last thing I wanted to mention about Outer Space is that this is one of the websites that I have that includes the IndieWeb ring on it. So this is just an example of one of the fun tools that somebody in the IndieWeb community made. If I remember correctly, this is something that they had been talking about for years, and then finally at one of the conferences or at one of the events, they finally just did it. And here it is now. So it's really fun. It reminds me of the old school web rings that were online. Like, I mean, maybe they still exist, but I just remember, you know, when I was doing anime fan websites in middle school, you'd see a bunch of, you know, web rings for all sorts of communities. So I just thought it was so fun to see that brought back. And yeah, the way that the web ring works is you just click the arrows and you are taken to the next person's website. And you can see that it's cool because different people have different ways of implementing it. So like I think I kept mine pretty similar to the original here. Um, Jason just took the text out and left it with the icons. Um, yeah, so you can see that it works exactly like an IndieWeb ring. I like that it's not too invasive. And it's actually just been a really cool way to explore other people's websites within the IndieWeb.
Yeah, these are awesome.
Yeah. And I also have the same thing on practicing design, just because I wanted both outer space and practicing design on there. So practicing design, as I mentioned earlier, is the place where I keep a lot of my shorter term writing, things that I don't expect to be as relevant um, as time goes on, but which I still kind of want to document and write down, whether it's because sometimes they may include info that I wish somebody else would have written down that I was searching for, or just, you know, for posterity. But I try not to really confine myself to any one um, subject, mainly just because the purpose of a lot of these projects is just to force myself to get my ideas out there, which I've struggled with so much in the past. So I like this idea of, you know, getting the idea out there, getting it out of my head, and maybe as time goes on, refining and discovering what it is that I like to do more, or that I think I'm better at, or that gets more attention, that makes me happy. But right now, it makes me happy to just explore and kind of get these ideas on paper. So I guess an example of that, which is a fun one for me, is what to listen to while working from home. Um, so this is another example, like the Delicious Bookmarks project, where I just had I love listening to soundscapes when I work, and I just started amassing a list and realized that there's some pretty obvious distinctions in the types of ambient soundscapes that you can find online. And I kind of just wanted a place to organize that info for myself and provide it for anybody else who might be interested in it. So um, it turned into this like huge blog post where I included just like all of the cool a lot. Some of them are like YouTube, which is a rabbit hole that I didn't want to go down, but a lot of them are really just customizable soundscapes on websites versus non-customizable soundscapes on websites. Um, and there's even like a YouTube gist down here. that's searchable, just in case you want to, I guess, share the data set or whatever. But so yeah, I think that if I were constraining myself and trying to be like, oh, this is just a design blog, or oh, this is just a web dev blog, or this has to be about this or that, I think I would miss out on opportunities like this to just have fun and um, write something that I guess encapsulates this particular rabbit hole I went down and continued to go down. So yeah, and I think that this approach has definitely served me well so far. Like I said, I do plan to maybe start focusing a little bit more in the future, but for now, this has been a really good way to just explore my interests and document the thoughts as they occur to me. And actually, for anybody interested, this blog post, which was the first one I made on this site, actually summarizes a little bit more about the kind of temporal delineations that I use for my websites, specifically for practicing design and outer space. Just talking about the short now and the long now, and why I find those distinctions useful, and why I especially find them useful for online digital representation.
Did these two sites, the short now and the long now sites, pop up at the same time, or what's kind of yeah?
They did. So interestingly, pretty much everything that I'm showing you popped up within the past year.
Okay.
The start of it was really the commuting project that I showed you, the charting commuting project. Everything after that kind of, it was just a jumble. So like even like the posting dates for these might be a little like, this is February, and I think maybe the commuting project was January, but yeah, it was essentially at around the same time where I just I feel like if I had tried to consolidate all of these ideas into one website, it would have been too convoluted. And in a way, this actually helped me in terms of how I plan my own projects or how I choose to act upon certain ideas. But in a kind of taking a step back, it also tied into an overhaul that I did with my personal knowledge management system this year. So it kind of all is interconnected.
Cool.
And
then one more question. Sorry.
Oh yeah. Go ahead.
I noticed you wrote about your review of Hexo. I was just wondering what, the general summary of your feel of using it as compared to rolling your own.
So Hexo is interesting. I've enjoyed it definitely so far, and especially for somebody like me, like once again, I know basic web development stuff, but definitely something like this was an opportunity for me to try to learn something new and to like work with a framework, basically static site generation at all, but also just in a realm that I wasn't used to. I know there are a lot of other more popular static site generation tools out there, but with Hexo, honestly, the thing that convinced me was the theming. I just wasn't as impressed with some of the themes that I found in some of the other frameworks that I'd been looking at. Because I guess at the time, I had a really clear idea of what I didn't want. And so I think just in doing research, Hexo seemed to have the best balance of theme availability, active community, and support. One thing that I will say is that there were a few cases where problems that I had were the solutions were only available in Chinese. So I ended up like having to translate like Stack Overflow or GitHub related support pages that were in Chinese, and maybe not getting the best translation of what the solution was. But I think that for somebody who's like more experienced than I am with web development, they might have a different opinion on this. But for my purposes, I've really enjoyed it.
Awesome.
Having said that, this website is documenting, if you are somebody who is at the same level of knowledge as me, somebody who's maybe dipping their toe into static site generation or like, some sort of anything like that. I think this is a good documentation of what it is like to do that when you are more of a novice, and kind of some of the pitfalls that you could potentially come across. Um, which, for me, like Node, just making sure you have the right version of Node installed in the right directory, like that ended up being its own debacle. I think because of the way that I had originally installed it, but also even beware of special characters, depending on the front matter you're using for your posts, because sometimes that can cause certain errors. So yeah, it seems like a big old blog post of warnings, but really it's more like a big old blog post documenting um, the things that might happen if you're new to it and you know aren't as seasoned.
It's good to, I definitely, like, I'm guilty of this, of like pointing people to like, oh, just go use a static site generator. You can just take a folder from Markdown and turn it into a website. And it often is not quite that easy. So it's
Right.
nice having sources that, show what it's actually like.
Yeah, well, like this is a case where I had installed Node years ago for something else and then never touched it again. And I was like, oh, I'll be fine. And then it ended up being a big old thing. And so, yeah, for me, that was kind of a case where like this thing that you think might be easy, or even that other people might think is easy, like I would hope that if you're trying to use a node-based framework, that at the very least you have ensured that Node is working correctly on your computer. I didn't do that. So, yeah. Um, so that's it for practicing design. Unless you or anybody else had any questions about it, I was going to move on to the next website, mainly just because this is writing focused, productivity focused, whatever I'm feeling at the time. Okay, so this brings me to I don't know what to call it, like my personal website, my portfolio website. For years, I used this website for my professional portfolio. And throughout this past year of kind of reconsidering what I want what I want my online presence to be and how I want to represent myself online, I decided that I really wanted to start focusing and pushing more of my personal projects. Um, just because that's kind of where I'm playing more right now and kind of experimenting and just trying to push my own boundaries. Um, so for now, I've kept my professional work on Behance and on Dribble, even though I don't include that here yet. But the idea being that as a designer, and I know that maybe there are a few different philosophies about what it means to be a designer, but for me as a designer, I definitely think that it's my job to not necessarily inject my style or my stylistic opinions into every project that I get. Um, I definitely think it's my responsibility as a designer when I get a professional project to design according to the problem that we need to solve. And, there may be times where the visual solution is not something that I would agree with, or it's something that is maybe less exciting than I thought it would be. And so to that end, that's not to say that I don't like my professional work or that I'm not proud of it, but just that after a few years, I felt like I just started to fall into the same patterns, even visual patterns, and um, especially in the realm of like marketing design and stuff. You're obviously just trying to, or I was at least trying to stick within certain like visual conventions and trends that I'd seen on purpose. So that's all to say that I kind of just wanted to take a step back from that this year and encourage myself to cultivate something more playful and something that isn't driven by somebody else's design problem, and maybe something that was just more driven not by a problem at all, but by an idea. So sarahhibner.com is kind of the place where that lives now. It's essentially where I've chosen, I called it design, like design briefs earlier, but it's essentially where I've chosen to document my design thought process as I made these projects. Um, And it's also just the place where I've, it is motivating to see these projects build up on this homepage. When I first started this, I think I had 2 projects. Yeah, in January I had the commuting infographic, and then I had a website that I made for one of my friends. So just being able to see over the months that stack build and to feel accomplished, and to know that each of these is projects that was motivated by an idea and by like my own personal inspiration, it feels really good. So I will go into one of these projects. The layout for each like case study, I guess you could call it, is pretty similar. We just have the project title, the date, the URL, the description, a quick description of my design approach, a description of any design challenges I faced, the tools that I used, and then the inspiration. And I really want to touch upon the inspiration because I wish that more people did this, not even just designers, but people in general. I love to know where your ideas come from, and I think that there are other people out there who similarly care about how I came to these visual conclusions, and not even just visual conclusions, but conceptual conclusions. So I do try to make it a point for most of the projects that I work on. You'll notice in some of the outer space projects that I did that, to just note, who inspired this? Was it a specific poster? Was it a specific artifact? Was it somebody's project? Was it an event? Yeah, because I think that for a long time as a creative person, I didn't really, I mean, it sounds really dumb, but I didn't understand how other people were inspired by certain things. And for a while, I found it hard to be inspired by certain things. So documenting it like this has just been a great way for me to be more inspired by other things now, because I don't know, it's just with all of these projects, it's like laying the roads for new ideas and new thoughts, laying the foundations for those new paths in my mind. So yeah, I wish more people would do that, and I try to do it as often as I can.
Love that. Is that like, do you have to, when you're making these sort of reports on a thing, do you have to go back and try and excavate the original thing that inspired you to do something? Or
Surprisingly not. So for every single one of these, it's actually been really easy for me. If anything, it's just excavating the example of the thing. So like, for example, let's see. So I own this poster, and it was just a matter of being like, oh yeah, I got it here. Like I originally was going to include images of the things that inspired me, but I didn't think that it worked here. But in other cases, I think the funniest example actually is this this one, because it's one of the inspirations was a toothbrush. So let's see if I open that up. Let me close this. I hope it's still. Let's see. Yeah, so these toothbrushes, just the color, especially in person, something about it, I was just obsessed. And then, so that's a case where, these are things that are around me. Like this is another example where this is a dish towel that I use, that I just have, and it's kind of the example where, like, obviously in this case it was, oops, I don't know how to, okay, well, there we go. Yeah, obviously in this case it's the color, right? In both cases that is the connecting element there. But when you look at what the website actually looks like, you can very much see that it's like I went hard for those colors, because I just couldn't get them out of my head. Once I got into this project and worked with Eric and we talked about it and stuff, I just couldn't get those 2 colors or that colorway out of my head. And so I tried to include that down here, and I tried to say, these are the specific things that were inspired or that inspired this particular element of this project. Because it's fun too, right? Like, I think in my design school era, I thought that you could only be inspired by certain things, or that it had, it had to be a piece of art, or it had to be this person. But over here, I'm getting inspired by like a toothbrush pack and a dish towel. And I kind of just want to let people know that maybe you don't have to take it
Yeah,
as seriously all the time, or that sometimes you find inspiration in places you don't expect.
that's awesome.
Yeah. So one thing I do want to mention before I move on from this site is the web mentions. So this is
Yeah.
let's see. So I need to fix the padding down here. I don't know why it's doing that. But so this little box down here that says mentions online is essentially an implementation using webmentions.js or webmention.js that essentially anytime somebody posts or writes about my website, sarahhibner.com, it shows up down here and basically just says like this person mentioned you in this place. So for example, if I click on this one, you are taken to Jeremy Felt's notes on IndieWeb Camp East Online, day one. And the reason that I'm in here is because he linked to my website right here. And he mentioned my intro to variable fonts presentation. So it's really cool because without him having to do anything else other than just include my website here, because I have web mentions set up on my website and because I can display them using webmention.js, although there are many other different ways that you can use to display them. Mine is like the most basic implementation. I can now see them here. And the same goes, if I were to mention anybody on any one of these project pages, or even, if any of these websites that I link to had web mentions set up as well, we would be able to do the same thing. So you can almost carry on a conversation with people based on the web mention alone. And just to show you really quick what that actually looks like. So right here, these two lines of code are essentially all that I need to include to be able to receive web mentions from other people. And this is a service, like obviously you have to sign up for the web mention service. There's a lot of different options for that depending on your website setup, but I have a static website, so that's why I had to go the route that I did. And then this is where we have webmention.js, and this, oh yeah, and then that's the web mention container right there as well. So it's a pretty, I mean, it's, in terms of actually implementing it, it's nothing too crazy. It's just something that I think maybe some people may not know about or may not find as much use in, but I've definitely seen some really cool implementations of it. And I've seen a lot of people use it as a way to start consolidating their data if they're posting it in a lot of different places.
Yeah. So was there any kind of like learning curve in setting it up, or it was pretty much drop in and it worked?
It was drop in and it worked for me. So like if so this is webmention.io, and they do a pretty good job of just giving you some basic info. The other thing though is there's additional info on the IndieWeb wiki. If you search for it, yeah, so there's a bunch of information here about different examples and people using, depending on, well, I guess in this case it's different people's websites, but they go into the sometimes the tech stack that they use, or even just showing an example of how they did it or what it is.
And then yeah, Joel had a question in the chat of, are you ever worried about, or is there a way that the system deals with like random people linking to your thing? And I don't know.
Yeah, so it depends on how you use web mentions. So like in my case, I think So yeah, like there are multiple ways to
I love that you sign in with your website. Like
yeah,
your
so that's another thing. IndieAuth is essentially this is built on the back of IndieAuth, which is a way to authenticate in various IndieWeb services using your website. Um, so like in here, if you give me 1 second. So you can see here that technically there are more. So this is your dashboard, and once again, this is just one way to do web mentions, but this is because I'm using webmention.io. This is what I see when I log in, and so it tells me what my recent web mentions are. But you can see that it gives me the option to remove them if I don't want them present.
Okay.
And it also gives me the option to have block lists where I can block certain domains. So it does give you some ability to kind of control, if you do get any bad actors or just people saying inappropriate things, you can definitely work with it there.
Gotcha. But have you had to deal with that at all, or has it
Oh,
been
no.
largely great IndieWeb folks doing it?
Honestly, every single person that I've met in the IndieWeb is just so helpful and nice and like just great. So yeah, I've not had any problems like that whatsoever. And if anything,
Awesome.
I mean, I'm just not that popular online, so it's not like I've got a ton of people trying to hit me up. Maybe it would be a bit different if that were the case, but yeah.
Very cool.
And then the last one, which I had brought up a little before, is just the Meet Me in Space website that I have, which I call it my digital garden. I think that's a very loose interpretation of it. But I've essentially just been trying to find a way to publish the notes that I take, specifically the book notes that I take, but even just the research notes that I take, because I'm interested in not just communicating my ideas when they're complete, but and being better at communicating, sparks of ideas or, seeds of ideas that I may have, or even ideas in progress. Um, just in the hopes of collaborating with people, giving other people ideas. I don't personally care if people take my, like if somebody takes my idea, if anything, like tell me that you did it so I can see the cool thing you made instead. That's kind of like my approach right now. So yeah, but in terms of the book notes, the reason I went with TiddlyWiki is because of the bidirectional linking, which there are other tools that are super popular for that, like Roam obviously is a huge one. Notion recently jumped on that as well. But TiddlyWiki has a plugin that also makes that possible. And I liked the idea of being able to do that in a statically generated way, especially since, once again, this representation of the website is severely lacking in functionality compared to this version that I see locally. So that is kind of a drawback because, for instance, if something has tags, I think I stopped using them specifically for this reason, but if something has tags, you can't click on them in this representation of the website. You can only do anything with them on my local version. So I haven't updated this as much because of that, because for a while I wasn't sure if I still wanted to stick with this idea of with this way of documenting my book notes and adding other sorts of notes. So it's still kind of up in the air, but I've decided to try to keep exploring TiddlyWiki because I also think that I just didn't give it enough due diligence for some of the things that I wanted to accomplish.
But was there a steep learning curve with it, or like because it's the sort of other main non-static, or just like it's a pretty big stack, right? Like TiddlyWiki's a whole. There's like a lot to
Well,
explore.
the interesting thing with TiddlyWiki is that it is there are a lot of different ways. I would say there was a learning curve for me because I had no idea what it was, and I don't know that much about web development to begin with. So it was overwhelming, the many different ways that you can implement it. There's locally hosted ways of doing it. I guess I can just like here if I So I believe, yeah, if we go to platforms, so this is actually a lot more simple than what they used to have, and maybe I'm just looking at the wrong place. But yeah, so they basically give you like a few options. You could do, so I went for the node-based option, but there's a few different ways that you can do it. But then if you, let's see, yeah, they had like, okay, I'm not even gonna look for it now, but I would say yes, there's a bit of a curve. It also just, your mileage may vary. It may depend on you know, maybe you've used comparable wiki software in the past that might make it easier for you, but I definitely was not experienced with just wikis in general. So that could have something to do with it.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah. And that's pretty much it. There's a lot.
Awesome.
I could philosophically go into a lot more about why I do this way, but I really kind of wanted to focus on the breadth and just kind of explain, yeah, how some of them are made. But yeah, if you have any other questions, let me know.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons I like your site so much is I think the philosophy behind it comes across in like both the content and also just like the descriptions of each individual site. So yeah, I really love the whole spectrum of it and the big picture we got on it today.
Thanks. Yeah, I you know, I guess the elevator version, the elevator pitch version of this, of why I do this, is just because media preservation. You know, I want ideally these websites to be around for as long as I'm alive, and maybe even a while after that, if that's feasible in the future. And to that end, I think that what, you know, you hear about so many social media MySpace, for example, shutting down and somehow losing all of that data. But that's, I mean, GeoCities, Delicious, MySpace, it's
Yeah.
happened over and over again, and it's just going to continue happening. So for me, this is a way to kind of take back a little bit of that control and just control the way that I represent myself moving forward for years.
I did have one last question about this Where I Am post, which is like, if you went 2 years or 5 years in the past, would these graphs look very different? Like, how much has your web of presence on the internet changed? And
So that's a really great question, actually, because that's kind of the next iteration that I want to do for this project in particular is, and I'm not really sure how to accomplish it yet, but almost like a version history, kind of centered around like last updated whenever. I like this idea of being able to navigate back in time and see, you know, how my digital presence did change, because this whole, actually this whole row and this whole row and this whole row didn't exist before last year.
okay, yeah,
That was just like an explosion of being online and trying, you know, because before that I didn't have a Twitter. I didn't, you know, like for the Sarah Hibner version of things, there is no Twitter. There's a lot of stuff. So I think for me, it was a way to explore some of these new platforms, because that's one of the things that I want to emphasize too, is just because you know, I'm making these websites, just because I care about hosting my own content and my own data, doesn't mean that I still don't want to engage with these other platforms. You know, I definitely do, but it just means that I have more delineations now around what it is that I want to post on something like Twitter or Dev2 or Reddit versus something on my own website.
Yeah, I think like I've kind of seen both ends of the spectrum where people, you know, have their super cloistered internet websites where they'll only post everything and rehost. I think Word is a little bit like that to a certain extent, rehosting all the things that they link out to. But I really like the not necessarily middle ground, but like intentional approach that you're
Yeah, well,
taking with it?
I think part of it comes down to, going back to the media preservation stuff. I think for me, it's a trade-off of like, what do I actually care about preserving and what am I
Yeah.
okay with losing when it comes down to it? Um, and I think that maybe that's kind of informed my relationship with how I post things and share things in these different contexts is this stuff, this like things on outer space, things on practicing design, things on sarahhibner.com. Those are things that, if some like Blade Runner like blackout occurred, those are the things that I would personally care about. And other people have different things. Maybe it's photos, maybe it's home movies or video games or something like that. I mean, video games are rising in importance to me now too. But the idea is that yeah, like what matters to you and what can you do to make sure that it lasts a little longer.
Awesome. I think that's a really nice note to end on. If no one has any other questions in the chat or anything. But yeah.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was just, yeah, really inspiring and a lot to think about. And yeah, I really love all the sites we got to see, and I'm really looking forward to. It feels like you've already done so much, but you're like just started last year, and so I'm really looking forward to seeing where it all evolves and goes on top of that.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Jared, for the opportunity. And in general, I've been slowly working my way through the interview series that you've already done, and I've loved it. So thank you for
Awesome.
doing this. I think that this is a great idea, and I just love your take on just kind of owning what you do online. And so yeah, I'll definitely be keeping up with that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, for the plug, if anyone's interested in keeping up with these, I'll probably be posting them on the hyperlink events, hyperlink.academy/events.
Awesome.
And also I'll tweet them out. Yeah. Oh, and I've been informed that I should plug, I'm doing this internet homesteading course on Hyperlink Academy that sort of is a big social exploration of a lot of these ideas. So if anyone here is interested in that too, you should check it out. And do you have anything to plug, Sarah? We don't normally do plugs on these.
No, I'm terrible. I'm terrible at these things. Like I don't care about the attention as much as I care about, like I care if anybody here's my plug. If you are at all interested in anything that I'm interested in and you want to just talk or collaborate, then reach out to me.
I love it. All right. Sweet. Thank you again, Sarah. Thank you everyone for coming and hanging out. And yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Thanks. Bye.
See y'all.